This week on Q&A, Major General Marcia Anderson discusses her role as the highest-ranking female African American in the history of the United States Army.
Major General Marcia Anderson, I read somewhere that you were shy as a young person.
I was painfully shy as a young person. I was the kind of kid who was kind of a bookworm in school and was much happier reading in the library than engaging with other kids. I mean, I had a few friends, but I was pretty private and hated to be called on in class. I knew the answer, but I wasn't the one who was always popping up and throwing my hand up in the air to answer the teacher. And unfortunately, when you're one of the smartest kids in the class, and the teacher wants someone to give the right answer, you do get called on a lot. And so, but my palms are always sweaty. I would literally get physically ill when I had to answer questions in class or stand up and read a book report. So, of course, over time that's changed, and the military has been a big part of the reason that changed, because you're compelled to give briefings to people, to give motivational talks to your soldiers. So you have to put that all aside and either at some point learn how to do it or just kind of gut your way through it.
In the early part of November, you made a speech to something called the Opportunity Nation. I just want to run 30 seconds of it and show you in your professional, your uniforms and making a presentation.
Okay. My parents, my father, was a Korean War veteran. And what he really wanted to do while he was serving the Korean War was to work with planes, whether it was to fly the planes or work on the crews. But because of the limited opportunities at the time, he was a truck driver. My mother was one of the first young women, to integrate the Catholic high schools in St. Louis, Missouri. She was a clerical worker.
First woman to integrate the Catholic high schools in St. Louis. How did she do that?
There was a group of 4 young women, it's my understanding, and she was one of the 4 who entered Rosati Kane High School in St. Louis, Missouri, and I think it was 1952, if I remember correctly. And actually what happened, and the reason I even knew this, was one of my 8th grade teachers at my grade school in East St. Louis told me that she remembered my mother as one of those young women, and my mother apparently was a pretty good intramural basketball player. She was about 4'0", and she'd never mentioned to me that she ever did any sports. So it was kind of neat to have my 8th grade teacher remember my mother when my mother was a freshman in high school and kind of talk to me about that. My mother never talked about that experience, though. That's all I really ever knew about it, was that she did it, and she graduated from that high school, and so did I.
How much did you ever ask your mother about the integration issue?
You know, not very much, and she was always kind of matter of fact about those kinds of things. That it was something that she had to do. You know, she certainly benefited, I think, from the experience, because she kind of instilled in my brother and I just sort of well, this is what you have to do. You know, get yourself together, collect yourself, and just drive on and get it done. She never talked about the expectations she had for us, but we always knew they were high. I mean, we grew up with lots of magazines in the house. We went to the library every Saturday to take out books, and as I said earlier, I love to read, so to me that was a treat, going to the library on Saturday. And so it was just kind of her expectations. We didn't sit around and talk about this a lot. It was simply, you're going to get good grades in school. You're going to try to excel at whatever you set your mind to do. I joined softball and played volleyball in grade school. I was never very good at it, but her expectation was you give it 110%, whatever it is.
Rosati Kane High School.
Yes.
You also went there.
I did.
And where is it? And why was there even segregation in the school back in the 50s?
I'm really not sure, and maybe it simply was, something that families just didn't consider or as an option. I don't know. And that's probably a conversation I should have had with my grandmother and grandfather, and I never had that one either. I regret that. But I don't think it was as far as I know, I don't think it was anything that said you couldn't go to school there. I'm not aware of that. So I really don't know.
You talked about your father, and you said he wanted to do more than he did, and he ended up driving a truck, and he was in not Vietnam, the Korean War. By the way, are they alive?
My mother passed away while I was in graduate school, and my father is still alive. He lives in Wisconsin.
Explain what you were talking about when he wanted to do more than he was able to do.
He and I were talking one day, and to just kind of back up and provide some context, I didn't even know he had served until I was promoted to colonel, and he was at my ceremony, and he began to talk about it, and he actually then pulled out his discharge certificate and put it on the wall. And then so over time, since then, we've had infrequent conversations about his service. But he didn't actually deploy, but he stayed stateside, and as I said, drove trucks. He was a driver for officers. Kind of how our conversation got started was he told me one of his best jobs was driving a colonel when he was when he was serving. So, but you could tell he had other aspirations. But as I say, that's kind of where he ended up.
What did both parents end up doing in their lives?
My mother was a clerical worker for most of her life.
Where?
Worked in offices, hospital, in a hospital in East St. Louis, Illinois. She and my grandmother worked there for a little while. My grandmother ended up her career working for a salvage operation, again as an office help person. And so my grandmother, told me when she was older that one of her dreams as a young girl was to go to nursing school, but she couldn't afford to. There just wasn't any money to send her to nursing school in the family. So the opportunities I've had, along with being in the military, having the opportunity to go to college because of the various scholarships and grants that were available, just didn't exist when they were all growing up.
You're a Creighton undergrad?
Yes.
And a law grad from Rutgers?
Yes.
Any other education in there?
Well, I've attended a number of military schools. You have to in order to advance and get promoted. So I have a master's from the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
I wonder if you've ever done what I did in preparation for this interview. I started to read about it, the Korean War. There was a mention somewhere about Harry Truman desegregating the services. Mm-hmm. I found his executive order, which was issued on July 26, 1948. And the first paragraph of it, I'm going to read it. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. This policy shall be put in effect as rapidly as possible, having due regard to the time required to effectuate any necessary changes without impairing efficiency or morale. And when you read on, the service wasn't really desegregated until 1954, after the Korean War was over.
Right.
Have you studied that part of that history?
That's something I wasn't aware of. And that kind of brings back some thoughts that my father did share with me about that period. He described one event where they were having difficulty getting access to facilities on one of the installations where he was serving. And he complained about it to one of his colonels that he drove. And the next thing he knew, he told me, he said there was a kind of a town hall or an assembly called by the post commander. And he basically said, this is not how we do business. These soldiers that you're serving with are to receive equal treatment. And he said that things got better after that. So, and I think that's just an example of how the military does a lot of things, is, when we're given a directive, the leadership, they take it to heart, and they make sure the soldiers understand that they support it fully, and then that's passed down the line, and then everybody just moves out and we make it happen. So he said things got a lot better after that town hall. I don't think it was called a town hall, but it certainly was an assembly where the post commander made it clear, we are going to abide by the executive order in every way possible.
You're in the spotlight a bit now for being the first Major General female African American in history of the U.S. Army. Have you gotten tired of telling your story?
No, I haven't. Maybe it's still early, But I think the first time I realized that that was the situation, I was kind of overwhelmed. But then the more I thought about it, I said, you know, this is a great opportunity. I mean, it certainly brings a responsibility with it, but I think it's a great opportunity for people to take a different look at the military, have a different perception about who we are, what we look like, what we do, who's in the military. I know that it's resonated a lot with young women. I've gotten a lot of emails and messages and letters. And I think it just shows how our armed forces has consistently led the way in terms of providing opportunities and rewarding people who work hard.
You're in the U.S. Army Reserves, 206,000 strong. What's the difference between being in the Army Reserve and being in the regular Army?
Well, when you're a citizen soldier, and it's exactly what that means, is you're a full-time citizen, and you're as a part-time soldier. But I think since 9/11 and even before that, the part-time piece really wasn't part-time, because with the advent of technology, I'm almost always in contact with what's going on. And the way I kind of explain it to people is, how do you manage this? People say, how do you manage this? And I say, if you're passionate about something, say you care about your child's soccer career, so you become an assistant coach or a coach. Well, you somehow figure out how to work that into your daily life and into your schedule. It's very much the same for people who serve in the reserve. It's something that we are, I think, at bottom very passionate about. We care about our country, and we feel we have a contribution to make. So you figure out a way to fit it in with your full-time civilian career.
What's your full-time civilian career?
I'm a clerk of court for the United States Bankruptcy Court in Madison, Wisconsin. We cover 44 counties in the state, and my job there is very similar to being a general. I have a staff. I have an operational staff that manages the caseload. I have 2 bankruptcy judges that I work for. And it's one of the greatest jobs in the world besides this one, I think.
How long have you done that?
I've been with the federal court system, about 18 years now, 18 or 19 years, off and on. I worked at different levels in the courts. And I practiced law for about 10 years, but decided I really like the administrative side of it, the law. I like working with people a lot more. I get to do a lot more of that in my current position. And and bankruptcy is great because it gives people a fresh start.
How much of your time is spent in the military duties?
Since I came off of active duty at Fort Knox, I'd say I'm trying to keep it to around 5 days a month, but as you have to understand, I mean, that means that in the morning, before I wake up, I'm looking at my BlackBerry. At lunchtime, I try to get a lot of things done. Things happen after hours at work, so as I say, it's a balance.
So where do you spend your time now? I mean, are you in Madison? Do you still live in Madison?
I do live in Madison, outside of Madison, and I'm in and out of Washington, D.C. is at this point.
Who has a call on your time?
I still stay in touch with my civilian job because I have a BlackBerry from them too as well. And I just, whenever I have a moment, I'll check in with my office and see what's going on. But I've got a great staff at the Bankruptcy Court, and they know what's in their lane, and they know unless it's a huge emergency that they really need my involvement in, they're pretty capable of handling it themselves.
So of the 200-some thousand that are in the Army Reserve, how many of them spend 5 days a month in the service work?
I would say, depending on the level and what your job is, I mean, this is just a wild guess. I mean, not knowing them personally, I'd say probably 25% of us probably could look at their schedule and say, yeah, I spent about that much time doing things over the course of a month for the Army Reserve.
What's your job now in the Army Reserve?
I'm the Deputy Chief Army Reserve, and I'm an individual mobilization augmentee, which means that I can be called up at very short notice and placed on active duty. So I'm not a traditional reservist in the sense that I go to a location and I have a weekend meeting with other soldiers at a fixed location, and I also have a training obligation, statutory training obligation. So my time is pretty flexible, since I obviously work for the Chief of the Army Reserve, and that is a, organization's located at the Pentagon and also at Fort Bragg, I will sort of split my time as I need to between those locations and, work on some projects. But that's pretty much what I'm doing right now.
How long have you served on active duty?
As I was at Fort Knox for a year. That was my most recent time on active duty. And want to just roll back for 1 second. My main project that I'm going to be working on for General Stoltz is to try to take what we're calling the continuum of service and create the policies and processes that will make that a reality. And what we're really talking about there is kind of trying to figure out a way to allow soldiers to move seamlessly between civilian life and active duty, depending on where they are in their personal and their career life cycle. Because right now it's very difficult to make that transition from active duty, if you want to, and to continue and serve in the reserves, and then move back again because of a lot of the policies and laws and regulations that we currently have in place.
How much does it help you that you have a federal job as the clerk of a federal court?
Yes.
Is it easier to move back and forth because of that versus working in an engineering plant?
A lot of the ability to be flexible and to serve, I think, depends on an employee's relationship with their employer. I mean, there are federal laws and regulations in place that protect your job if you have to go on active duty. But I think it's important for everybody, employer and employee, to keep open lines of communication, to talk realistically about what your service first means to you, and then what your job in the reserve entails in terms of the amount of time you may have to devote to it. And then I think it makes it that much easier for you to make that transition when you have to. But of course, there are, as I said, some barriers to that because we didn't have an opportunity after 9/11 we didn't have the luxury after 9/11 to take a look at our systems and processes and make the necessary changes as we evolved as a military. So that's been lagging. So our personnel and pay systems don't talk to each other. So it's very difficult to move somebody from traditional reserve status onto active status.
You've been in the U.S. Army Reserve from 1976? 79. Well, you were in ROTC at Creighton.
Right.
And you said that you had a science credit, and that's how you got into Army ROTC. Why would that be a credit in the science world?
I don't know why that was at Creighton, because at that time you had a certain number of basic courses you have to fulfill, and I had some part-time jobs because I was working my way through school, and I really wanted to take astronomy, but for some reason, military science at that time, Reserve Officer Training Corps, was counted as a science credit at Creighton, so I signed up, and I was able to fulfill that basic requirement that way.
As in your early life and when you were training, would we ever see Major General Marcia Anderson down in the mud?
Not at this point in my career,
no,
probably.
I mean back in the beginning when you were trained, did you have to go through basic training?
You had to go through a form of it as a cadet.
Did you treat women any differently than men?
No, absolutely not. I mean, we did everything. You got muddy, you got dirty, you low crawled, you did all the training exercises. You're expected to be physically fit, just as your male counterparts were, and that continues today. I think even more so. I think, as we've seen, women are much more involved. Even though people have this sense that there's a front line, there really isn't a front line anymore. And so you need to be a soldier, period, to be able to survive on the battlefield.
There's some interesting statistics about the U.S. Army Reserve. 40% of Army Reserve soldiers are minorities. The nation's something like 25, 26%. 25% are women. And out of the 6,136 African American officers in Army Reserve, 2,474, maybe it's just any officer, are women. Why so many women in the reserves?
Well, number one, I think it's the mission of the Army Reserve. We have a lot of medical units. We have a lot of units that are not combat type units. So I think we only have one infantry battalion actually in the Army Reserve. So the rest of our mission is logistics. We have, as I said, medical units, civil affairs, which involves a lot of special skill sets for civil affairs, very unique skill sets. So a lot of what we do, I think, is one, attractive to females, and two, it's just a welcoming environment.
Go back to what we were talking about earlier. You said an important moment in your life was when you watched your mother and grandmother deal with a car salesman.
Yes.
How long ago was that, and why did that have such an impression on you?
That would have been, let's see, I was in grade school. Probably I was in maybe second or third or fourth grade maybe. In the early 1960s, back in Illinois. And we needed a new car. So my grandmother knew the vice president of the bank, and we had a good relationship. We had a good banking relationship, I'm sure. And I went to school with his son. So they went to the bank and they got pre-approved, and they knew how much they wanted to spend on the car. They'd already kind of researched it, and they knew what we could afford. So we all went to the dealership. Well, there's my brother and myself, and we're kind of running around, and it was just my mother and my grandmother, and we walked into the showroom floor, and they really ignored them. And so they finally got a salesman who kind of reluctantly came over and, said, well, we're interested in buying the car. And again, there still wasn't very much interest. And I was observing all this. And eventually my grandmother, I think, or my mother, I don't know who it was. So look, we've got, a letter of, we're pre-approved from the bank, and it was one of the major banks in town. And once they realized that, their whole attitude changed. But I took away from that, it's important to be prepared. And, they had to be assertive to get the salesperson's attention and interest. And as a result, and they also knew what they wanted. They were not going to be talked into buying anything more expensive than we could afford. So they were very firm about that. So I learned a lot of lessons from that experience.
How much of that was race-related, in your opinion?
I think at that time in the early 60s, East St. Louis, now it's about 98% black, but then I think the mix was a lot, very, very different. And I think there was some of that involved, but I also think it was gender-related too.
East St. Louis has lost a ton of population over the years. What was it like living there? How long did you live there?
We moved there when I was in second grade, so I was about 8 years old. And I lived there through high school. My grandmother lived there until she passed away last few years. So a long time, and I saw it change. I saw it change from a fairly diverse city, although not necessarily balanced in terms of the government and jobs, to, as I said, one that's about 98% African American today. And in that time, of course, a lot of businesses left. The main street that used to be a bustling place on a Saturday, I think it's all mostly boarded up now. There's very little activity, commercial activity there anymore. At one point there was a study done that said about 75% or more of the population is on some form of public assistance. So it's prime real estate, I think, for development, but I think it's going to take some time for it to turn around and for people to recognize it's right across the river from St. Louis. It's got enormous potential that I think is untapped.
But when you live in East St. Louis, Illinois, you went to the high school, Catholic high school in St. Louis.
Yes.
How did that work? And why did you went to Creighton, which is a Catholic school. Why did you follow the Catholic education?
Well, my grandparents were both Methodist, and they were living in East St. Louis many years ago, and they wanted the best education they could possibly get for their children, and it was in the Catholic school system, and so they converted. And so all of their kids, all four of them, my mother included, went to Catholic schools after that. And so that was just kind of basically what my mother felt was the best path. And so she made sure we were enrolled in Catholic schools. And as I said, I ended up going and finishing high school where she went to high school. And I have an uncle who's a Jesuit. So it was kind of natural that I would attend a Jesuit college. Not natural, but I was accepted at a number of institutions, but I just felt more comfortable going someplace. And at that time, Creighton was their undergraduate was about 3,000 students. So it was a nice, comfortable environment, about 7 hours from St. Louis, so it was easy to get to.
When you think back about the fact that you grew up being shy, where did you begin to get out of that?
When I was a cadet in ROTC, because you're put into leadership roles pretty quickly, even in the Reserve Officer Training Program. And when you go to your advanced course between your junior and senior year, I went to Fort Lewis. It was called Fort Lewis at the time. It's about a 6-week period. And you are rotated through various leadership roles. So you are going to be the platoon sergeant for the day. And you're going to be responsible for getting your 40 people from point A to point B all day long and accounting for everybody. And then you're going to have to brief them up on what's next on the schedule. So you start to have to stand up in front of a group and assert yourself and maintain control over that group and capture their attention. So you're just compelled to.
In your speech, by the way, what was the crowd that you were speaking to back in early November at the it was sponsored by Time Magazine and AARP, and what were you there to talk about?
To talk about how the American dream for me was very real, and to talk to especially the youth in the audience about kind of what it took to reach this point in my life, and my real belief that opportunity still exists for our young people. It's a little bit harder these days, but I think we can still have people have dreams and goals, and we have ways for them to achieve those dreams and goals.
I want to run a clip of you speaking about growing up in St. Louis, East St. Louis, and we'll continue.
75% of the population was on some form of public assistance. 1/3 of the families subsisted on less than $7,500 a year. Even today, the population there, the median income is less than $11,000. It was once described as America's Soweto. 98% of the population is African American. That's where I grew up. My mother scraped together money to send us to Catholic schools. She patched our pants because she couldn't buy new ones. She scraped together the money so we could have magazines to read in the house, like Newsweek and Time, and of course, Ebony and Jet.
Talk about the last comment about Ebony and Jet. You smiled when you said that.
Well, she wanted to make sure that we saw African Americans doing other things. And those magazines provided those opportunities about business leaders, entertainment, sports, so that we knew that there were things and people were doing things in our community that they weren't necessarily doing in East St. Louis. So we would just have examples and role models.
What did she do to scrape together the money? And do you remember, I know this tuition now is something like $8,700 at that high school. What was it back when you went there? Do you remember?
It was a couple of $100s.
And how did she find the money?
You know, I honestly don't know. I mean, my mother and grandmother were great savers. Somehow they managed to save money. They researched ways to live as frugally as we possibly could. But I never felt deprived. My mother would find money to take us to cultural events. I got to hear, an African American pianist with the St. Louis Symphony. She made sure we got tickets to go see things like that. So I don't know where she found it, but she did.
You said that the people of East St. Louis, Missouri, median income is $11,000?
Yeah, I did a little research on the internet, and that's what I came up with, yes.
How can you live on $11,000 a year?
I don't know. I will say that, as I say, it's a depressed area, so, rents are not expensive, because the housing stock is not that good either. But yeah, I really don't know how people do it. I really don't.
How much do you feel the need to talk to younger African Americans because of what you've achieved and tell them how to do the same thing you've done?
I think they need to, a lot of kids don't want to talk to their guidance counselors in high school, and I know I didn't, because I didn't think they were very helpful. But there are lots of scholarships out there. There are lots of opportunities like the military to give you a full 4-year education if you want to go on to college. We need to take better advantage of trade schools and community colleges. I mean, there are lots of untapped resources out there, and if they'll just go talk to their teachers or their guidance counselors or someone that they trust to give them some ideas. Because I think, you know, they see the people around them and maybe think, well, this is all there is. This is all there is to life. But I think they need to be, you know, they need to take advantage of the resources that are available.
Were your parents split? Did they divorce when you were young?
My parents were divorced by the time I think I was a toddler and my brother had just been born. So that was about late 1950s.
So your mother and grandmother raised you?
Yes, they did.
So there's a lot of examples of that we see all the time when people talk about it. What was different about your life? I mean, specifically, what was different about your life, do you think, that got you to where you are?
As I said, I think it was just that expectation, even the unspoken expectation, a given that I was going to go to college. There was never a question of that. Nobody had a real strategic plan for that, how that was going to happen, but they just were determined that that was going to be my reality.
Was that mom and grandmother both?
Mom and grandmother both. And, you know, we always talked about college. It was just one of those conversations that we were having. You're going to be going to college, and so you need to think about this, and what else do you need to do, and you're going to get good grades in school. I think nowadays that they would have done a lot more research about it. They might have said, whoa, that's going to be very difficult to do, but it was just kind of you're going to figure out a way to do it, and we're going to help you.
What kind of a student were you?
Well, I was a pretty good student. I loved school. I thought the best day was when I got all my books for the first day of school, and I start reading them. I would start reading my books the first day, even before classes started. So I was always curious. I loved learning about other places and new things. The one thing I hated, though, was math. I never was excited about math class, because I never quite understood why I needed to learn all that algebra and stuff. But I just loved history. I loved English. Just enjoyed it.
Why do you think you loved it? And again, what would you say to others? I mean, there are a lot of kids out there that don't have two parents in the home and don't even have one parent paying attention to them. How do they get out of it?
You know, it opens up new ideas. I loved reading because it was kind of like, to me, like a movie. When I started reading a good book, it was like I had my own movie, my own personal movie. And then I'd learn new words. You'd learn about different places that I've since had a chance to travel to as an adult. It just opens up new vistas, new ideas, just opportunities.
Why did you pick Creighton, and what was your major?
As I said, it was, you know, my uncle's a Jesuit. At that time, he was the artist in residence at Creighton. A lot of the professors there were people I had known when he was in seminary, so they were kind of like my uncles. As I said, it was a smaller school. It wasn't so big that I would feel lost or overwhelmed. They had a great reputation academically. I was a political science major because I was interested in going to law school. And again, I was very curious about, well, history. I think history and politics kind of interwoven, so there were two areas of interest for me. So that's pretty much why I chose Creighton.
And how about law school? Did law school come before or after you did your initial military service?
I joined ROTC while I was an undergraduate at Creighton, and it just so happened that one of my ROTC classmates was already in law school at Creighton. And so I spent time talking to him about his experiences. And I then went to work for a corporation after college for a couple of years, while still working in my Army Reserve obligations. And then about 2 years after working for that corporation, I decided it was time to go to law school.
Why Rutgers?
Well, once again, I didn't have a lot of thought involved in why I did something. I applied to schools on the East and West Coast because I grew up in the Midwest and I'd never seen the ocean. So I said, I think New Jersey is pretty close to the ocean. Well, it was. But it also had a good reputation. It had a great clinical program and a reputation as a very good academic institution. And it's a state university. It was also a lot less expensive. But as I say, I got a lot of bang for my buck by going to that university.
Where did you meet your husband?
In a receiving line for a colleague of mine, who's, well, a mentor, I should say, who was getting promoted to Brigadier General. And we met in the receiving line for that event.
Where?
In Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
How long have you been married?
11 years.
Children?
Stepdaughter. And this is the second marriage for both of us. But and I'm a new grandmother as of August. So he's my best friend. He was in the reserves at one point. He got out a long time ago. But he's my sounding board. He calms me down when I get excited about things. And yeah, Amos he's a really good guy.
Go back in your military career, and or as far as that goes, your job as clerk at the court, and name some people that spotted you and said, I want to help her, and gave you some tips and helped you move to the next rung.
I think it would have been when I was a major, and my battalion commander at the time, my brigade commander at the time, and I'm having a senior moment, I can't remember his name, but I marched into him and said I wanted to be a company commander. I made an appointment and said I knew there was a vacancy coming open, and he just was kind of astonished that anyone would come and do that, probably, and so he gave me that chance, and there were some people who were resisting that, not my fellow captains, but some of the older officers who had never had a female company commander in a basic training unit. And then, they saw how I applied myself and how I really tried new ways to help get my soldiers, my drill sergeants, ready for our mission. And then after that, it just kind of snowballed. I had a great mentor and a Brigadier General retired Anthony DiCorletto, who lives in Connecticut, and he was a great guy. And he kind of encouraged me to think about getting my military education done and maybe aiming for the War College. I didn't even know what the War College was. He had to explain it to me. Brigadier General retired Bob Cocroft. He's the officer whose promotion ceremony I attended where I met Amos in the receiving line. Master Sergeant retired Mabel Holmes. A lot of NCOs have helped me in my career.
Let me just stop you there for somebody that hasn't followed the military. What's an NCO?
Non-commissioned officer.
What's the difference between being a commissioned officer and a non-commissioned officer?
Commissioned officers, like myself, you start out as a lieutenant and work your way up. Non-commissioned officers enlist for certain periods of time. Officers are indefinite. Once we are commissioned, our commitment to the military is indefinite until we resign. Enlisted soldiers sign a contract to serve for different periods of time, 4, 6, 8 years, or indefinite. So that's the difference. And there's a lot more enlisted soldiers than there are officers. And we like to call our enlisted soldiers in the Army, they're the backbone of the Army, because they're the ones who get things done.
But the relationship between an enlisted person and an officer is what? What do you call each other?
Well, they'll call you, whatever your rank is.
General.
So, and, we'll call them sergeant, whatever their rank is.
Or do you call them by their last name?
Let's say Sergeant Jones.
They're not about to, enlisted person isn't about to call you Anderson.
No, they're not about to call me Anderson, but they'll call me General Anderson, or when I was a lieutenant, or lieutenant, they'll call you by your rank. But it's a manager, employee, not employee, I'd say it's a supervisory relationship generally, but also colleagues, because the NCOs are subject matter experts, and they are also the ones, as I say, who execute what officers plan and imagine and resource.
Who salutes first?
The non-commissioned officer or someone who is junior in rank to you.
Can you generalize that there are a lot more people who are commissioned officers who graduated from college, and those who are NCOs did not?
Well, I think that may have been true years ago. We have a highly educated force of soldiers, period. And a lot of our soldiers who are enlisting now as privates already have their degrees. And while they're in the service, a lot of them have an opportunity to pursue and get their college degree and go on and get masters and PhDs. And I work with non-commissioned officers who have PhDs. And that, I think, is one of the reasons we have the best Army in the world.
So if you ask somebody who was a non-commissioned officer and had a PhD, why would they say they'd rather do that than be an officer?
Well, they'll tell you that they work for a living and officers don't. But I think it's the opportunity, as they say, to actually execute and actually work in your specialty, because once you reach a certain point as an officer, you're really more of a manager. You're not actually sometimes not getting out there to be with the soldiers. You're more directing, as I said, and trying to find the resources so that the soldiers can get their jobs done. So you don't get to, play and hang out with the troops as much.
All right, you're a major general. You could become a lieutenant general and a four-star general.
Well, in the Army Reserve, there's only one lieutenant general, and that's Lieutenant General Stultz.
Your boss.
My boss. And I'm perfectly content to do my job as a major general, and that's all I'm looking at right now is that job.
All right, let's say that you're having a private conversation with another woman, and she's second lieutenant, bottom of the rung, starting out, and she comes to you and she says, there's no cameras around. Tell me what I'm going to be faced with as a woman, as an officer, in front of soldiers that if I were a man, I wouldn't see. What tips would you give her?
I think that question, if, in 1979, there would have been a lot of differences. Now in 2011, I would tell her what they really want from you is, one, that they can trust you, that you are going to take care of them. Whatever the mission is, you're going to make sure, though, that you take care of your soldiers, that you are a professional, that you're not just competent, that you're good at your job. And I think that's really all anybody wants from their supervisor or their manager, is to know that, I'm working for somebody who gets me, number one, and cares about me, but also is good at their job. And I always tell people, don't go for them, don't shoot for the minimum, because sometimes you'll miss that mark. And that's true whether you're taking an Army physical fitness test or someone's giving you a task or a project. Don't shoot to do just the C work. You've got to shoot for A work. So
what's been looking back on your career in the Army, what's been the toughest situations you've had?
When I was talking about trust, and I was given the company command for the basic training company.
And where was this?
This was in Lodi, New Jersey. The unit was located in Lodi, New Jersey. And I walked in that first day to meet my drill sergeants. And they were all males. And it was me and my first sergeant. And the look on their faces was sort of like, oh, we got the female captain. But and I kind of knew that I needed to gain their trust, that I knew the business. I was enthusiastic about training soldiers, taking soldiers off the street and taking citizens off the street and turning them into soldiers, and that I respected them as professionals, because one of my former commanders used to say, and this is very true, before there's a war fighter, there's a trainer. And that's what drill sergeants are. They start out and take people who don't know their left from their right, a private from a general, and which end of the weapon the bullet comes out of, and turn them into soldiers. And they do it in a very short period of time.
How long did it take you to feel that they trusted you?
I'd say a couple of months. But it was a gradual process. But I mean, I've never been one to say, well, we've always done it this way, so I'm going to do it this way. For example, one of the things that we had to do in those days was to rehearse before we went, rehearse their classes of instruction that they were going to give the basic trainees. And the typical practice was somebody would stand in front of the room, and the captain, the commander, and the first sergeant would critique the class. Well, I got a video camera, and I said, we're going to do this differently. I'm going to videotape you, and then all of us are going to critique you together. And one, they got a kick out of seeing themselves on a video, but no one had ever done that before, and they actually were able to see more areas to improve. And so they kind of started looking at me a little differently after that, when they said, well, she's kind of got a different way of doing business, but she gets it, how important it is for us to be good instructors.
What kind of money can somebody in the reserve make in a year? I know it varies from, private first class to
right.
Major general, but what can you take away?
Well, for an example, a weekend meeting or battle assembly on a Saturday and a Sunday for a member of the Army Reserve is the equivalent of 4 days' pay for an active duty soldier. So say about a week's pay, close to a 5-day, 5-day work week. And then the statutory training requirement per year, 12 or 14 days, which is full time. So that's 2 weeks right there. So, I mean, it's hard for me to give you the taxable dollar figure, but just if people think about their own job, how much you make in a week, and then if you had 2 weeks of 2 weeks pay, then add all that all together.
So you can get a couple hundred days a year in pay.
In essence, yes.
So if you do 50 weekends, 52 weekends or whatever.
Correct.
A couple hundred days.
Correct.
What other benefits? You have health benefits?
There's, since I joined, you do have access to TRICARE, which is a wonderful benefit. People pay a fairly minimal for a family of 4 compared to what if they were trying to get this insurance on their own. And then you have access to the regular medical providers. You don't have to go to a military installation to receive the services. So that's been a great benefit to people in the Army Reserve.
So I'm 20 years old and I joined the service and I want to go to college. Do I get any financial help?
You have access to tuition benefits. Whenever you serve on active duty, of course, you're then eligible to use GI Bill benefits.
But let's just say I'm a weekend warrior, as they say.
Oh, okay.
And I'm in the Army Reserve and all that. How much of college would you pay?
Now, I'll have to refer you to somebody who's an expert to provide you information about that. I'm not that familiar with the benefits since I already had my degree when
But is it enough to be of great value to you? And
oh, absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, can you get your whole education paid for?
No, I'll have to refer you to somebody to answer that question. But you can get a substantial portion of it paid for, yes. There are tuition benefits.
Do you fill all the slots easily? Are there any, how's recruiting these days?
We are making our mission pretty, and actually I think we made our mission early. I think across the Army, as a matter of fact, last fiscal year.
How much does that have to do with the economy?
I'm not a recruiter, but I would say that does play a role. But I also think we've done a better job of explaining to people, one, the benefits to being in the service, whether it's full-time or as a member of the Reserve or Guard. And I think that has resonated with a lot of people, that you can learn a lot of skills in the Army Reserve that you won't necessarily gain in the private sector.
Let's go back to the question I asked you about a woman sitting in front of you, or several women saying, give us advice about being a woman in the Army. Let's say a young African American comes to you, a young African American woman. Is there any difference in the way you would advise them that they're going to be treated?
Again, I think, the military really leads the way in terms of providing opportunities for people, being an organization that welcomes and values diversity and leverages that diversity.
Is there any evidence that integration is not working in the military?
Not that I can see, no.
So if it works so well in the military, why doesn't it work better in the society at large? Or does it?
That's a good question. I don't know. I can't explain that. And I don't know if it's just the culture in the military that, okay, we are going to be the best military in the world, so we have to use and leverage all of our assets. Because warfighting is serious business. And if you go into the game with the same points of view and the same people, you're maybe not going to get the best results. And so maybe it's the urgency of what we do and the seriousness of what we do that has compelled us to embrace it, maybe quicker than some other sectors have. I don't know.
You told a story somewhere about driving in your car listening to oral histories in which you heard a granddaughter interview a grandfather and he had some recommendations for her. What were the circumstances? Why were you listening to it? And what was the message you got out of it?
I believe that was the StoryCorps piece that they sometimes do on NPR, and that kind of resonated with me because he was just kind of giving her some lessons on life, and one, she was interested to hear what he had to say, which I don't know how many people sit down with their grandparents these days and just talk with them about what they experienced in their life, and just that his advice was so basic and simple. Work hard, keep your family close,
But you said that he told her to have courage.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well,
To you?
To me,
Yeah.
yes, to me. To me, that meant not being afraid to try things that maybe are a little bit scary for you. Kind of like when I, joined ROTC. Something unfamiliar. One, I needed the credit, but it was unfamiliar territory. Not to be afraid to speak up. Throughout my military career, I kind of prided myself on not being afraid to tell people what I thought. Because one, the worst thing you can do is to let a senior leader head down the wrong road if in the back of your mind you're thinking, sir or ma'am, maybe we ought to take another look at this, or maybe we ought to look at this from this perspective, because people's lives could be at stake, or we have an obligation and a duty to be good stewards of the resources that the public entrusts us with. So you sometimes have to be kind of courageous in a meeting where everybody else's head is going up and down and you're going, I think I have a different perspective. And you have to have the courage to speak up and say that. And I've never been shot down for doing that.
So what's been the toughest part of all this? I mean, listening to you talk, I say, this has been easy. Marcia Anderson just marched through this thing, got her 2 stars. But what's the toughest part of all through your life and going to law school, becoming a clerk in the court, and now a major general in the reserve?
It was unfamiliar territory for people in my family. And so I had to kind of make up my own playbook as I went along. One thing I learned to do, though, was to be a good observer of people, and particularly people who did certain things well, to try and figure out how they did it. So you kind of have to pick up those subtle cues. And I think sometimes a lot of our young people, they either think they can only find it on the internet. I said, sometimes you just need to sit in a meeting and listen. You need to listen to people. And you definitely, as a senior leader, need to do more listening than talking. So I kind of learned those things as I went along. And I would study people who were successful. I love to read biographies, so I would read their biographies and kind of learn lessons from the things they did and also from the mistakes they made.
Do you have a favorite biography? Or a favorite person that you've read about?
Abraham Lincoln. When he hired a lot of people, not hired, but selected a lot of people, appointed a lot of people in his cabinet who were actually some were his adversaries, and pretty vocal adversaries at that, because he wanted those different points of view in the room, and he wanted those different points of view to counsel and guide him. And I kind of admired that. One, the courage it took to put people maybe who didn't have your best interest at heart, but the courage to try to seek out people who were going to disagree with you, maybe, either ideologically or just in very basic ways.
All right. What's the difference in the way people treat you when you have your 2 stars on, your uniform on, and when you're a civilian? Because you live in those 2 different worlds all the time.
That's where my husband is really good. He reminds me that I'm not general when I'm at home. People do a lot of things for you when you're in, at this rank to try to free you up to do the thinking that you need to do, to get the work done that you need to do. So you get a lot of assistance to get through your day, which I really appreciate.
They're also afraid of you, aren't they?
I don't think I hope they're not afraid of me. I try to remind them that I'm just like them. I put my pants on one leg at a time in the morning, and I have the same kind of concerns they do about getting through my day.
But when do people know you're not happy?
I don't know. Well, I'll tell them. I'm not a yeller. I'm not a screamer. As I say, I'm a pretty level-headed person. But I'll let them know if they've disappointed me. If I've asked them to do something and they've not met the mark, or they've given me the answer they think I want to hear, I'll tell them, I think you're just giving me the answer I want to hear.
Can you remember in your career a military officer that treated you in a way that you said, I'll never do that?
Oh, a couple of times.
And what was it? Give us an example.
Well, there was one officer that I worked for who didn't have a high regard, I think, for women in general, but this is many years ago, and would dismiss me when we had meetings and I had an idea or I had a thought about a course of action we might want to take. And so he was a bit dismissive, but I kept plugging away. Because eventually something was going to get through. I guess I'm kind of hard-headed that way.
Did you go to a higher rank than he did eventually in this whole
Yes,
business?
he got out long before I did. I'll just put it that way.
So when you're back home, you live where?
I live in the Madison, Wisconsin area.
In Madison.
Madison, yeah.
In Beloit?
Well, no, I live outside of Madison.
I think it's like Verona.
Yes.
A small
Verona.
town.
Yes.
When you're on the job doing your civilian job, what is the day like?
Well, I get up in the morning and work out fairly early, and my husband and I usually drive in separately. He'd like to carpool, but our schedules are so crazy we really can't do that very often. I get into the office, just a lot of things very similar to what I did in the military when I was commanding a unit. I check in with my staff, my chief of staff, find out what's going on for the day. I have a chief deputy at the bankruptcy court who functions basically like a chief of staff, handles the day-to-day management, and I work on the resourcing issues, work with the local bar, on whatever they need help with, if they need any help. Try to do a lot of strategic planning and thinking about where the court's going to be in the next 5 to 10 years, and try to find ways to position us to be ready.
And you said earlier you like the fact that there is a bankruptcy court.
As I said, it gives people a fresh start. I mean, a lot of the people that we see in our court didn't get there because of poor habits. It's because of a job loss, or they've had a catastrophic medical illness in their family that's depleted their resources. And so, by and large, the people, at least in my court, as I've looked at the records, they got there because of some misfortune, and not because they were spendthrifts.
Going to write a book ever about all this?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess through all this, I found it interesting that people find me interesting. I'm going to do my best as I go through the rest of my career to talk to as many young people as I can, to encourage and motivate them. Because I think, I really do believe that that's the next generation, and we've got to do everything we can to give them all the tools they can to succeed and achieve their dreams and goals.
So make sure I get this right. The headline is Marcia Anderson, Major General, United States Army Reserve, is the highest ranking female African American in history in the Army.
That's correct.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.